So let me introduce our first speaker in the panel on perspective on the Iranian longue durée, part 1. So Dr. Julian Degen is an assistant professor in the Department of Ancient History at the University of Trier. He specializes in many aspects of Mediterranean studies in the Near East, from the Achaemenids to the Roman economy. And is currently writing his habilitation on maritime economy in Strabo's geography. His first monograph on Alexander just came out last year based on his dissertation at the University of Innsbruck. He has also co-edited several volumes already, and with scholars at this conference, present at this conference, namely Professors Rollinger and Klinkott, and has one edited volume in print, a companion on Persian Achaemenid Empire in German, and many articles. His talk today connects many of these threads and is called The Achaemenids and the Desert. So, welcome. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Julian Degen.
First, I want to thank Professor Shaigan and Marissa Stevenson and Robert Rollinger for inviting me to come to Los Angeles and to speak at this wonderful conferences to such a well-respected audience. It's a great honor for me to be here. Let me directly start with my talk. A paradigm that still dictates the way how modern historians view the ancient world is that the scientific thinking of the Greeks was unique in the Mediterranean world. The way that the Greeks were describing and understanding their environment is believed to allow no comparison with other cultures. This applies in particular to the geographical thinking of the classical Greeks. Although describing, structuring, and measuring the world has not been developed into a scientific discipline until the Hellenistic age, the work of Greek intellectuals produced ample evidence for the popularity of such queries. Unsurprisingly, modern scholars have analyzed in painfully minute details and microscopic point of how the Greeks were understanding the world. But they still have not given an answer to the question of exactly where the origin of the Greek concept of geography might be sought. However, although specialists are aware that the Achaemenid Empire has stimulated manifold political processes in the Aegean world, they do not attest any function to the empire and the emergence of scientific thinking in classical Greece. Accordingly, modern scholars still believe that the revolution in geographical thinking has not taken place until Alexander had conquered the East. They assume that this achievement allowed Greek intellectuals to study the worlds of Asia more carefully. As a result, the Greeks are believed to have enhanced their knowledge on the world in the time after Alexander. Accepting this paradigm means that the Achaemenid Empire has left no intellectual impress in the Mediterranean world. I think it's time to liberate the discussion from the structures that have dominated it for over a century and reject the idea that the impress of the Achaemenid Empire in the Greek world was only limited to a political discourse. By studying the Greeks' responses to the geographical information that the Achaemenids have disseminated in their official language, I would like to venture a shift in perspective. In what will follow, I present arguments favoring the view that the Achaemenid claim to universalism was a decisive stimulus to the emergence of Greek geographical thinking. To be sure, such an argument presumes that the imperial worldview was based on targeted geographical information geographical statements, so that it is possible to examine the reception by various audiences. That this is true will be shown by the development and reception of the Achaemenid claim to universalism that is based upon the idea of the extremes of the world being a desert. Previous scholarship has not paid attention to this aspect, which, as I believe, merits serious examining. My talk today includes two segments. By departing from earlier forms of geographical conceptions, I will outline the development of the Achaemenid idea to universalism. Considering the idea's context will contribute to a greater understanding of its original purposes and its reception by other cultures. To study the various responses to the imperial geography, an analytical lens will be required. Thus, I will introduce the concept of inherited geographies that serves as a theoretical framework to analyze the influence of geographical concepts of empires on the worldview of imperial and non-imperial societies. I shall begin with some remarks on the geographical statements found in the Achaemenid inscriptions. The Greek king Darius I has placed a monumental trilingual inscription in front of the Apadana in Persepolis. Due to its three versions, the inscription is fraught with peculiarities. Reading them reveals that the text differs in terms of emphasizing on ideological aspects. The variances can be explained best with the different cultural contexts of the versions. These are on the one hand the Iranian tradition, represented by the Old Persian and Elamite version, and on the other hand the Babylonian text. There are many reasons why the Babylonian version merits further investigation. Focusing on the Babylonian version allows to balance the Achaemenid text against the great many others, thus revealing its intellectual development. The Babylonian version goes as follows, I quote, Ahura Mazda is great, who great over all gods, who created the heaven and earth and created water, who gave all prosperity, who gave all prosperity and people to live on, who made Darius the king, and to Darius the king he gave the kingship in this wide earth of many lands, among them Parsa, Media, and other lands of other tongues, of mountains and plains, of this near side of the sea and that far side of the sea, of this near side of the waterless desert and that far side of the waterless desert. Darius the king says, with the protection of Ahura Mazda, these are the land which did this which was done here, Parsa, Media, and other lands of another tongues, of mountains and plains, of this near side of the sea and that far side of the sea, and this near side of the waterless desert and that far side of the waterless desert, as I had ordered them. What I did, all in the protection of Ahura Mazda I have done, me, Ahura Mazda, may protect with all the gods, me and what I love, end of quote. As the Babylonian text doubtlessly illustrates, the most distinctive property of Achaemenid imperial ideology is its claim to universalism. This idea is the theoretical and not the factual claim of imperial formations to world domination. To achieve such a claim, ancient empires have used particular mental maps, which are the geographical expression of the world view. In other words, geography has been a powerful vehicle to ancient empires for representation. Modern scholars usually view the ocean as the geographical point of reference for ancient Eastern empires when interpreting the ideological value of such claims. The reasons for this are easily explained. As early as the 23rd century BCE, Mesopotamian rulers began to create mental maps that equalized the Mediterranean Sea and the Persian Gulf as both the fringes of the world and the empires. Whilst the function of the sea as a reference mark for empires to claim universalism is well understood, the function of the desert has not previously been studied in detail. Its ambiguous semantics warrants closer examination. The Babylonian expression Kwakwa Tsamamiti translates as desert. It's a compound of two terms, both of which need clarification. First, the term Kakaru means a region without definite geographical contours. In contrast, the Babylonian term Matu designates a defined land or region. Seen against this backdrop, the term Kakaru translates as vast space. This interpretation is further supported by the fact that the term Kakaru is used to translate the Old Persian term Bumi, that means the world in its entirety in the Achaemenid inscriptions. Thus, it appears that the desert implies an indefinite space without concrete spatial dimensions. This qualifies the Achaemenid geographical information to be a mental map. Second, the term Tsumamitu is the qualifier of the compound and derives from the Babylonian word Tsamu, which literally means first. Given the semantics of the expression, the land of the first, it seems that Darius has claimed to control forbidding regions of unknown spatial dimensions. To the modern historian, this geographical information remains a diffuse concept that requires further qualification. However, this claim was surely more nuanced to the inhabitants of the ancient Near East than we would initially expect. What can contribute to our understanding of the Achaemenid text is the imperial representation of the Neo-Assyrian kings. There are many reasons why the Neo-Assyrian Empire deserves to be labeled as the first paradigmatic empire in the history of the ancient Near East. Not only the fact that the Neo-Assyrian rulers have controlled almost the entire Near East from the 11th until the 7th century BCE, they enhanced the prevailing idea of universalism. In the Sargonid period, roughly spanning the time of the 8th to the 7th century BCE, universalism has been a commonplace to Assyrian kingship. This period saw a constant expansion of the empire, and therefore the agonistic behavior of the kings towards the predecessors has gained dynamism. To meet the demands of the rulers, the scribes of the royal inscriptions have created new tropes and adjusted mental maps. This process was visible in the Assyrian representation through the steady expansion of the empire's horizon towards the fringes of the world. To argue universalism, the Assyrian kings have claimed to reach the upper and the lower sea and the desert, both of which they thought to be the extremes of the world. A landmark in this process was the statement of Esarhaddon that his enemies have been fleeing from him to a remote place that he calls the midst of the sea. This implies that the prevailing map has been expanded from the shores towards unknown maritime space. At the same time, the Assyrian kings have expanded the geographical horizon not only towards the maritime fringes of the world, but also towards its terrestrial extremes. Thus, we can observe exactly the same process of geographical expansion in the case of the desert. Finally, the Assyrian representation entertains the idea that the enemies of the kings have fled to the midst of the desert when the king was arriving. To emphasize the remoteness of the desert, the royal inscription highlights the fact that not even birds can fly over the waterless desert. Arguably, it needs particular skills, which only this Assyrian ruler shows to safely tramp this forbidding terrain. This idea has become a defining feature of royalty in the ancient Near East. A good example for the continuation of this idea is an inscription of the new Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II. The king is praised as someone with whom the gods travel on path of first. And this consists an important quality in the world of royal inscriptions. Here, geographical information on the midst of both the sea and the desert had been studiously vague, so that the audience believed that these were places in indefinite spaces. However, it was just a matter of time before this idea became outdated. Beginning with the reign of Esarhaddon, the midst of the sea has served no longer as an appropriate reference point for the Assyrian kings to claim universalism. He was the first ancient Near Eastern ruler who has claimed to rule the lands that lay even beyond the midst of the sea. By time, this idea was developed further by his successor, Ashurbanipal. He has stated that he received tributes from the ruler Gugu of the land Lydia, which is said to lay on the opposite shore of the sea. Lydia was considered as the remotest place in the mental map, so that the geographical expansion has allowed Ashurbanipal to state that his ancestors had not heard of its existence. And again, at the same time, the process of expanding the imperial horizon can also be observed in the case of the desert. Whereas Sennacherib had proudly highlighted the fact that the so-called distant Medes, who were said to live in an unknown land in the desert, gave him tribute. The succeeding rulers enhanced this idea. So it came that Esarhaddon claimed to have received hostages from the land Batushara, which he locates in the so-called midst of the land of the distant Medes. This land is said to lay in a salt desert, and therefore the audience of the royal inscriptions considered it an unapproachable place. As we learn from reading the inscriptions of Ashurbanipal, who has succeeded Esarhaddon, the inhabitants of the so-called land of the Medes have rebelled, thus suggesting it has been included to the empire, so to say, a further expansion. Let me return to Esarhaddon. Reading his royal inscriptions reveals that not only the extension to the east was linked with reaching the midst of the desert, he has claimed universalism by proudly stating that he had reached the midst of the desert where we today map the Arabian Peninsula. So far, we can see that the expansion of the horizon of the Assyrian Empire in all directions was associated with reaching the remotest places of either the sea or the desert. Expanding the geographical horizon was the result of an ideation that has been stimulated by a discourse on empire. This process has not come to an end with the rise of the Persian Empire. It should be noted with interest that this ideology was not further enhanced in the aftermath of Assyria's downfall. The Neo-Babylonian rulers have used a traditional claim to universalism that predated the totalized claim established by the Sassanids. Its rulers have never referred to the desert when claiming universalism. As we learn from reading the so-called Cyrus Cylinder, the most important source on Cyrus II available to us, the Theocene period saw no change in the discursive frameworks of universalism. The Babylonian scribes have specifically highlighted that Cyrus has received tribute from the Amurians that has already been considered as a remote land in Assyrian times. Due to the Babylonian perspective of the Cyrus Cylinder, it seems that the idea of universalism has not been developed further in the reign of Cyrus. Using the desert as point of reference to claim universalism, however, continued to be important in the reign of Cambyses II, who was the son and successor of Cyrus. He is said to have added Egypt and the sea besides to the Persian Empire. By this means, Cambyses gained the upper hand in the prevailing discourse on empire. Interestingly, Cambyses has focused on the desert immediately after the conquest of Egypt. According to Herodotus, the great king has attempted to conquer Ethiopia, that is the land on the fringes of the world in the histories. But things went a different way. The Persians have suffered heavy losses in the Great Desert due to insufficient preparations of the king. In other words, Cambyses failed to act out the ancient script of expanding the empire towards the fringes of the world in the histories of Herodotus. The next step in the process of ideation has been taken with Darius. And as we already have seen, this ruler has totalized the idea to universalism that has prevailed in the ancient Near East. He did this by claiming that he even controlled the lands beyond the ocean and the desert. This proud statement implies that Darius has expanded the empire to the regions of the world that were thus far not explored. His reason that also includes, for example, the lands in the north, as the steppe, for example, that has never been mentioned in Assyrian and Babylonian inscriptions before. Darius' reason to create such a claim might be best explained with his lack of dynastic legitimation, thus making it necessary for him to gain the upper hand in the discourse on empire. For this purpose, he has expanded the geographical horizon to a limit, thus preventing any further ruler to expand it. This discourse testifies to the existence of a mental map that describes the terrestrial extremes of the world as deserts. So far, I have looked at the development of the Achaemenid idea of universalism. In the second segment of my talk, I will address the question of the impress of the Achaemenid idea of empire in the imperial world. By imperial world, I mean both the administrative entities that are empires and their sphere of indirect control, namely the imperial borderlands. An example for such a borderland is the Aegean world. There is evidence coming from the empire itself and its borderlands that suggest the dissemination of the Achaemenid official language to the borderland. Greek literature gives clear and cogent evidence, showing without a shadow of doubt that the empire has disseminated targeted information on its vast space. This information possibly served the Greeks as a vehicle to acquire information about regions on which they had no common knowledge. Distributing an idea of empire that influences the inhabitants of the non-imperial world, however, is not a singular phenomenon in history. In a very stimulating paper, Sarah Radcliffe has addressed the question of influence of colonialism on the national geography of post-colonial Ecuador. By studying the geographical conception of school books and in popular media, she has argued that the world view of the former imperial master still consisted of the geographical common sense of the Ecuadorians, in spite of slight redefinitions in the post-colonial period. Thus, Ecuador's national geography has, so to say, inherited imperial geography by conceptualizing the world in the manner of the former imperial master. This suggests that the geographical concepts of empire have the potential to impress subaltern groups, and hence they are the conceptual frameworks of the knowledge. But this means empires have an effect on the worldview of societies even after the downfall. Therefore, the phenomenon of inherited geographies in the ancient worlds merits examination. This applies in particular to the Greek literature, which represents the richest group of sources on the Achaemenid Empire. The scope of geographical thinking was greatly extended by the time the Persians reached the Aegean world. Already Ionian scholars like Hecataeus of Miletus have described the world in a way that reminds us of imperial geography. The same applies to the histories of Herodotus, that is our most important source on classical geographical thinking. Herodotus was heavily engaged with various intellectual traditions, so that his work is representative for the worldviews that prevailed in the Greek world of his days. Concerning the representation of the extremes of the world, the histories allow comparison with the Achaemenid royal inscriptions. Rather unsurprisingly, the southwest and the south of the continent, Libya, are joined by a great desert in the histories. What deserves our interest is Herodotus' description of Ethiopia in this context. According to him, this land is laid on the fringes of the world, and desert must be traversed to reach it. Here, the great king Cambyses has failed with his expedition to Ethiopia and lost many troops to the inhospitality of the desert. The great king thus failed where the discourse on empire dictates him to be victorious. But the Libyan desert is not the only example of its kind in the Herodotean world. In his eyes, the easternmost part of the world is a sandy desert. It is noteworthy that this geographical information allows to be understood as an ironic criticism to Achaemenid universalism in a tacit way. Herodotus may state that Darius has conquered India, that represents the East in the histories, but there he did not reach the desert. Compared with the ideological program of the Achaemenids, the Herodotean Darius fails to achieve universalism. And Herodotus' ancient audience might have understood the implications of the statement, since the Indians were known to be subjects of the Achaemenids. Herodotus' description of the northernmost extremes of the world follows the same principle as that we have observed for the south and the east. The extreme north of the Herodotean world is a desert which Darius has reached in his campaign against the Scythians. Just as in the case of Lydia and India, the land of the Scythians adjoins a desert that cannot be traversed. Interestingly enough, the idea of the inhospitality of the northern desert found its way to a Mesopotamian toponym. The geographer Strabo mentions that an Assyrian village that is close to Gaugamela has been named the House of the Camel. There, a picture was displayed which honored the camel that has helped Darius on his march, full of deprivation through the deserts of Scythia, thus being evidence for the Achaemenids viewing the northernmost fringes of the world as desert as well. Given this smattering of evidence, a fair idea of the imperial impress in the Greek geographical thinking can be gained. This means that the fringes of Herodotus' knowledge on the world correspond with the geographical conception of the Achaemenid inscriptions. Seen from this perspective, the source of Greek geographical knowledge was less scientific explorations than a discourse on empire. The Greeks still considered the desert as the terrestrial extremes of the world even in the time after Herodotus. And an interesting example for the continuation of this idea is Xenophon's Cyropedia. He describes the boundaries of the empire as an inhabitable desert that he equalizes with the fringes of the world. Remarkably, even in the time of the transformation of the Achaemenid Empire into the Macedonian world empire by Alexander, the fringes of the empire and the world respectively were viewed to be a desert. So it comes that the first Greek authors that have joined Alexander in his expedition describe the land beyond the Durée as a desert. To make the ideological value of this geographical statement clear, the fact needs to be highlighted that this river was considered as the northernmost boundary of the Achaemenid Empire. The Greek authors used exactly the same idea in order to add credibility to Alexander's statement that he has conquered the southernmost extremes of India. These authors support their arguments with observation and significant changes in shadows, astronomical phenomena, and nature. The same natural phenomena and fauna which they place in India can also be found in Herodotus' description of Ethiopia. These writers wanted the readers to believe that Alexander has crossed the Great Desert and thus he has achieved universalism. Although the transformation of the Achaemenid Empire into the Macedonian world empire has caused ruptures, there are no signs that the imperial geography of the Achaemenids has perished. At the eve of Hellenism, when the Romans had gained possessions of the Near East, the terrestrial fringes of the world were still considered as a desert. Almost 300 years after the fall of the Achaemenid Empire, Rome's most formidable general Pompey is said to have marched through a waterless and difficult terrain close to the Hyrcanian Sea that was considered as the northernmost extreme of the world. The Roman imperial imagination, the land besides the water, were considered as the terrestrial boundaries of the world. This finally gave Pompey the opportunity to stage universalism in the course of his third triumphal procession in Rome. He has used this occasion to claim that he has carried conquest to the extremes of the world by using the geographical framework that has been forged by the Achaemenids. By a way of conclusion, the presented evidence suggests that the geographical arguments in the Achaemenid claim to universalism had a long-lasting effect on the ancient world. The idea of empire, which the Achaemenids have created, impressed the non-imperial world and finally served as a source of knowledge on the imperial space that has been considered as the world. The unvaried cultural associations with the desert through time can be seen as a good example for inherited geographical thinking, which has become the intellectual framework for the Greeks to conceptualize the world they were living in. Thank you very much for your attention.